Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here today. My name is Ken Lancastle. I'm the Chief Operating Officer with Mechanical Contractors Association of Canada. It gives me great pleasure to be introducing today's webinar on the Federal Plastics Registry, as well as our two speakers from MCA Canada member McMillan LLP. Just for background information, and I will primarily allow our speakers to do most of the talking on the topic, but the Canadian government introduced the Federal Plastics Registry on April 20th, 2024, with reporting obligations to be triggered as early as next year. So for construction companies and contractors, there are potential implications and several areas where this new registry may impact you. So we're very pleased, as I said, to have two excellent speakers from McMillan LLP here today to discuss what this might mean for mechanical contractors and their suppliers in Canada. As always, there's a Q&A function and a chat function built into Teams. I would encourage you to use that if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, and we will monitor that, and then at the end of the presentation, turn things over to Talia and Anik for Q&A. So without further delay, I'm very pleased once again to introduce Talia Gordner, Partner, Environment, and Anik Forstall, Partner, Construction and Infrastructure with McMillan LLP. So Talia, Anik, I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks so much. So I am an environmental lawyer in our Toronto office. Anik is a construction lawyer in our Toronto office. We work together a lot on various environmental and construction issues where there's some synergy there, and we write together a lot on these topics. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to start with where this Federal Plastics Registry comes from. So the Canada-wide Action Plan on Zero Plastic Waste. You can kind of get a level set of what's been going on at the federal government that informs this, because a lot of times this feels like it kind of comes out of the blue. But for someone who's been monitoring what the federal government's been up to and what's been happening globally on the plastic regulation stage, you'll see it's not quite so out of the blue. We'll talk, of course, about reporting requirements and key takeaways you'll need to start getting moving on any reporting obligations you have. And Anik's going to speak to contract implications arising from the Federal Plastics Registry. So really how this is directly, not just what your reporting obligations are, but how this is going to impact you in the more of the day-to-day and contracting aspects of your operations and in the industry. So let's start with the Canada-wide Action Plan on Zero Plastic Waste. This came into effect in November 2018. Each province and territory and the federal government have their own Minister of the Environment. There is a council, they all get together, and they approved in principle a Canada-wide strategy, or I call the strategy on zero plastic waste. And it's really focused on reducing plastic pollution, creating economic opportunities for recovery of the value of used plastics, and achieving Canada's goal of zero plastic waste. And they also agreed to put into place an action plan to actually implement the strategy. What's important here is the goal is aspirational, it's not legally mandated, but a lot of things that come out of it end up actually being law or legally mandated. So there's two action plans that come out of this. The first one is in June 2019, and it's really focused on the life cycle of plastics to create the recovery in the economy. So we're talking about looking at establishing national performance requirements, creating incentives for the circular economy, trying to create additional waste infrastructure so that plastics actually can be recycled, collected, reused, and not end up just being landfilled. And really trying to facilitate consistent programs across the provinces for extended producer responsibility, which are programs where waste at its end of life is being instead diverted to being recycled and reused and going into this kind of circular economy, which literally is intended to be that you do not throw out something and it ends up in the landfill, it's end of life, but there's some way to reuse all or part of it rather than just creating new plastics to actually be able to recycle and reuse them. Phase 2 comes out about a year later, and it's focused a lot more on improving ways that consumers, businesses, and institutions can manage plastic waste responsibly and focusing on education. And it's also really trying to look at opportunities to kind of capture and clean up and measure performance for plastics and invest a little more in research and science to inform their decision making. They also introduced this roadmap to strengthen the management of single-use and disposable plastics. So this is intended to kind of guide jurisdictions and support their efforts to reduce the negative impacts for environmental and socioeconomic issues arising from single-use and disposable plastics. It's important to know that while a lot of stuff we're talking about today is from the federal government, a lot of environmental regulations happen at the provincial level as well. You guys might just know that because you deal with your local, with the Ministry of Environment a lot of the times, as opposed to the federal government, which doesn't come up so often if we're dealing with excess soil or contaminated land issues a lot of the time. So, but this is federal, and so it covers all of Canada, but there is still regulation happening at the provincial level that overlaps, and these are some efforts by the federal government to help facilitate provincial regulation in this space. So what comes from all this? We have the federal single-use plastics ban, which has been enacted for a couple of years now. This is why you can't get a grocery checkout bag anymore. This is why your straws are not made of plastic. This is why those kind of stretchy beer rings, can rings, are no longer around. So that's already come into effect, and that arises from this strategy. The next is the Federal Plastics Registry, which, as Ken mentioned, was issued in April of this year. We also have recycled content and labeling rules for plastics regulations that are to come. So that would be actually marking on consumer products what parts, or if any of it, is actually recyclable in the system in your jurisdiction, not just if it's capable of being recycled, and also mandating certain amounts of recycled content in plastic products. And then the final one deals with primary packaging for grocery checkout materials, which I don't think is relevant to anyone here, but I just wanted to kind of flag that there's a lot of different things in the works in terms of implementing and facilitating this action plan. But today, of course, we're only talking about the Federal Plastics Registry. So this is a legislative instrument. It comes in the form of a notice under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is the federal government's main environmental piece of legislation. And this notice, when they published it, it established the Federal Plastics Registry. And the intention of the Federal Plastics Registry is to collect information on plastics that are placed into the market, plastics that are collected for diversion, which means away from the landfill, plastics successfully reused, repaired, remanufactured, refurbished, recycled, plastics that were incinerated for energy recovery, and also plastics that are imported into the country and that are exported out of the country. And the purpose of all this information gathering is actually to inform future regulation. So we haven't gotten any additional guidance on what additional regulation that may be. Based on what we see in the action plans, I would suspect it has to do with what is required to be diverted and reused and put back into the circular economy, where there's opportunity to mandate recycled content in plastic products, also what is going into recycling versus what is going into landfill, and maybe also some particularly harmful plastics or that have a really hard time breaking down, where there's a reasonable alternative, maybe swapping that out for another product. Okay, so what kind of products are required to be reported on? The list, high-level list is here. These are the categories under the Federal Plastics Registry. We have resins, which is what plastic is made from. I don't think that's going to come up very often for MCAC, MCAC or MCAC. But I've highlighted here in red the ones I think are most relevant, we'll spend the most time talking about today. So we have plastic packaging, electronics and electrical equipment, or EEE or EEE as it's fondly known, tires, transportation plastics, so various vehicles and mobility aids, construction plastics, agriculture and horticulture plastics, fishing and aquaculture, apparel and textiles. There is so much more plastic in your clothing than you would suspect, and single-use or disposable products. So we're talking food service wear bags, personal care products, novelty items, tobacco, vaping products, and personal protective equipment. So if it makes you feel any better, you are not the only industry that hasn't really been regulated in the plastic space before that is being targeted now through the Federal Plastics Registry. It's not just focused on construction, it's really covering a super wide range of areas that haven't been previously regulated, where most of the regulation's been focused on consumer goods and on food serviceware up to this point. So it is a huge expansion of scope of regulation of plastics in a way we haven't seen before in Canada. So let's talk about each of these categories. I think is the most relevant for the attendees at the call today. One is plastic packaging. So that is really a very broad term. It can be rigid or flexible packaging. if we're talking about a liquid of some kind, it would be the container. If we are talking about another product, it might be the packaging around it to protect it so it doesn't get damaged when it's being stored, packaging to ensure it is safe when it's being moved, shipped, transported, anything that kind of falls in the realm of plastic packaging. So it doesn't matter what kind of plastic it's made from, um, or if it's intended just to store or just to make sure it doesn't get contaminated, or it's for shipping, or it's the wrap that goes around a pallet. If it's plastic, it's probably going to be plastic packaging and fall into this category. That includes whether it's innocuous products that's being packaged or hazardous materials products, which I'm sure if your particular area is dealing with any of those, with any hazardous materials, that there's a whole subset of other legislation and regulations for the management, use, disposal of hazardous waste. This is in addition to that. So that kind of plastic packaging, if it's around some sort of fuel, chemical, lubricant, whatever, would still be obligated to be reported on, even if it's regulated elsewhere under other legislation. Then we go into the triple E category, which is the electronics, electrical equipment category. So there's a lot of things that can be engaged here. Each of these terms, by the way, I've listed the main subcategories. They're all defined. So the actual notice goes into quite a bit of detail of what's included in these. We don't have the time today to go through all those in detail, and everyone somehow has a unique product that we have to figure out if it fits into one of these subcategories or not. But I want to kind of cover high level the ones I think are particularly relevant to this group. So we have information technology and telecommunications devices or equipment. So this may be in the context of a construction project. It might be the intercoms within the building and speakers, audiovisual and consumer equipment and media, probably in the same kind of category. Appliances, we're talking HVAC, refrigeration, really just any large or small appliances. Tools, anything that's not actually kind of nailed down is what we're covering here. So we're talking about maybe power tools of any kind, anything that's not like an industrial nailed down type of equipment. It's a super broad category. Lighting, monitoring control instruments. A lot of times this is going to be thermostats, security systems, carbon monoxide systems, fire suppression systems, the kind of systems that actually control HVAC systems or these or fire suppression that are like much broader. So it can be just like a system that results in a flipping of a switch, or it could be something that's more akin to a, monitoring the entire system is connected to computer and it's making changes to the system as it goes. So it can be a very sophisticated and very unsophisticated system. Photovoltaic panels, which we all actually just call solar panels, and chargers for battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles. So I appreciate no one on this call is making any of these, but you might be installing them to buildings. I'm certainly seeing them in a lot more parking garages. So that might be something where you're engaging with that particular subcategory. And then accessories for use in or with any of these products in this category. So as you can see, it's quite broad. So if there's plastic in any of these things, it's going to be an obligated product in most instances. Then we move on to the construction category. So we are talking about windows, doors, interior finishes, walls, floors, ceilings, construction film and sheeting, insulation materials, paints, coatings, pipings and fittings, roofing materials, siding, cladding, decking, fencing. As I said, all of these are then further defined. So you're really capturing a lot of stuff in the construction industry, assuming it is made from or has plastic parts or components to it. So this, if we're talking about an HVAC unit, I'm going to probably use HVAC as an example a lot of the time, but you can take from that what you will. So if you are, we're talking about an HVAC unit, it is going to be an appliance under the triple E category, and all of the plastic packaging that's around it is going to fall into the packaging category. So you might end up having kind of two different categories that you have to report under for what you would consider otherwise one product. I think that's kind of an important point. So we're talking about plumbing fixtures. Sometimes you're going to get a big box of the same type of piece. Sometimes they're all going to be individually packaged in like clear plastic for each product so they don't get contaminated. And maybe because that's the easier way for the supplier to ensure they're kind of kept nicely and kept in good shape. All that's plastic packaging, right? So it might be like the primary packaging on the product and all the shipping, storage, and layers of packaging around it to the extent it's made of plastic. So then who's obligated to report? There's 3 categories here. And I'm going to start with the producer of the subject material. So this is actually a defined term. And what we're talking about here is it may be manufacturers, maybe importers, it may be the brand owner, distributor, supplier of the product. So you have to kind of look at each individual product, honestly, to see if you are or are not a producer. And I'm going to use the HVAC example again, because the way the producer definition works is it's a, if not this person, then that person. And it's kind of conditional and it moves down the chain. So the starting point is the brand owner of a product. So if you buy ABC HVAC unit, and ABC has residency in Canada, it has some sort of facility operation office in Canada, regardless of where you're buying ABC HVAC from, it is going to be ABC, the company, as the brand owner, who's going to be required to report on it. It'll be the producer of that product. Where it gets complicated is where your brand owner is not in Canada. So if they're not in Canada, and let's say we're importing ABC HVAC from the US, in that case, it's going to be the importer of record who is going to be the producer for that product. Even though it's not their product, they're not the brand owner, you're buying it from ABC, then you're required to report. If you're buying it directly, let's say. If your distributor supplier is in Canada and they are buying ABC HVAC and then supplying it to you, assuming that distributor is the first or supplier is the first import into Canada, they're going to be the producer of that product and they're going to be required to report. So one of the things I think the way we think about construction contracts, I'm sure Anik will have something to weigh in on this, is there's a lot of allocation of responsibility and there's a chain, right? So the mechanical contractors, to my knowledge, isn't usually contracting with the owner. There's usually the owner and then the GC and then maybe one sub-layer, and that's the mechanical contractor, or multiple sub-layers. So it's not really your project. It's a project you're working on, engaged to work on. So the idea that you would be the producer of a product that is going into this massive construction project seems a little surprising or shocking. But what this notice is focused on is not the contractual relationships on the construction project. It doesn't actually care at all. It's looking at who's kind of the first person to touch the product in Canada. That's the easiest way to kind of look at it. So if you're getting a product from a Canadian company, whether you're importing it from the US, but they have Canadian operations, or you're getting it directly from Canada, it's going to be that manufacturer, brand owner, supplier is going to be the person responsible. Excuse me. They're going to be the producer. But they don't have that presence in Canada. Then we start going down the chain. So then we're looking at who's the first importer in most instances. There's also the manufacturer level. I don't think that's going to come up as much for you guys. And then we go to the retailer. I'm sorry, guys. Something got in my throat. Just give me a moment here. So that's the challenge here. So if you are the one that's directly importing and buying the HVAC units, you may be a producer. If you are getting it from a supplier in Canada, you're probably not the producer. And that's kind of the first test to look at in terms of whether or not you're a producer. And I know there's gonna be a lot of questions from this and we will answer them. I just want to make sure we kind of get through these other issues because I think it can be, there's a lot of different scenarios that can come up through this. The next category where you're required to report is if you are a generator of packaging and plastic product waste in an industrial, commercial, or institutional facility. So if you have a project site where there is packaging and plastic product waste that's being generated, normally, everyone's plastic waste, all the non-hazardous waste is going to some bin that's being taken out regularly by whoever the waste service provider is for the project site. So in a lot of those cases, it might be the owner of the project, or in some cases, it might be the GC who would be the generator of the packaging, plastic, and product waste for that facility. To the extent you have your own facility where you are generating plastic waste, whether it's from packaging, whether it's from product, right? We cut things down, we break things up, things get broken, it all goes in the waste stream. You're required to report. So you can do it per facility, or it can be done if a company has multiple facilities, you can do it on a company-wide basis instead. The final category is service providers for the management of plastic packaging and products. I don't think anyone on this call is going to fall into that category, but essentially what we mentioned earlier on, which is that the regulator is looking for information on plastics at their end of life, meaning once they become waste, where are they ending up? Are they being recycled? Are they being diverted? Are they ending up in the landfill? So the companies that are responsible for actually providing those services are also required to report to kind of complete the circle. There is a small business exemption for each of these categories, and the threshold for it is 1,000 kilograms per calendar year. So what's interesting here is it's only per these categories I have on here: producer, generator, or service provider. So if you only generate 900 kilograms of plastic waste at each of your facilities, you don't have to report. Or yes, you don't have to report. If you are a producer for some of the products that you're importing or getting for your operations, for your use for various projects, and all of the plastic packaging, EEE, construction materials, all the plastic in those for the whole year add up to less than 1,000 kilograms, then you will meet the small business exemption. This is not done on a per project basis. As I said, the regulator is not interested in any of our contracts, any of our projects. They're just focused on what you as a company are producing as defined, as a producer is defined. So if you're working on 10 projects in the course of a year, you're importing X amount of HVAC units, and all of them add up, and that's all you do, and all of them add up to less than 1,000 kilograms per year, and you are the importer of record for those, then you're not going to be required to report. But if you're importing 1,000 units, and when you add up all their packaging, all the plastic components in the actual equipment, and it adds up to more than 1,000 kilograms, you're going to be required to report. So you have to think of it on a product basis. So, and when we talked about those categories earlier, you are adding up everything from those categories that's plastic that you are defined a producer of, and determining based on that if it's above or below 1,000 kilograms for the calendar year. So when do you have to report? There's 2 reporting periods. The first is for the 2024 calendar year, which we are starting to get close to the end to. That report's due in September 29th of 2025, so a year from now. And it's only required for this first phase for resins, which I don't think is an issue for you guys. Plastic packaging, definitely something we want to be aware of. Single-use disposable plastic products, I don't think this will come up very much for you guys unless it's PPE. And the EEE category, electronic and electrical equipment. For all other categories, and in particular construction, there's reports required for they're starting to require to be reporting in 2025 and 2026. And their reporting is, again, for the September 29th of the following year. So for 2025, it'll be September 29th, 2026. For the 2026 calendar year, it'll be September 29th, 2027. So you are likely to be engaged for the 2024 calendar year. You have a year to gather the information and figure out if you're obligated or not, which I'm happy to help people with. And I'm doing that a lot with a lot of different companies and a lot of different industries, because it's pretty challenging exercise in some instances, because in most cases you haven't really considered this before. But given what is required for the 2024 calendar year reporting, there's a lot of products here that are probably getting triggered that fall into the construction industry, even though the construction category doesn't actually have required reporting until the 2025 calendar year. So before I hand it over to Anik, I just want to cover some key takeaways for reporting obligations is now is really the time to prepare for these upcoming deadlines. Yes, the 2024 calendar period reporting requirement is a year away, but the reporting period is almost done, and it's really hard to get information on these kind of things after the fact, and it's better within while things are really happening to get a better sense of what you're bringing in, where you're a producer, what products, because as time passes, there probably is less and less record keeping on that, whether they were ever kept or nobody looking into it. So the farther time passes, the harder it is to gather the information after the fact. So it's a good time to get started. You also, of course, I say as a starting point, want to determine if any products that you are purchasing, supplying, using are products that are subject to the registry. So that's kind of the first point I usually look at. And then we figure out if you're the producer for that product. Because if you don't import or supplied with, purchase for your projects any products that fall within these categories, then this is kind of moot for you. But in most cases, there's something that's going to be triggered. And then we look at if you're a producer, and then we look at if you meet the reporting thresholds as well. So it's really useful right now to be gathering that information on what obligated plastics are used, supplied, manufactured, imported in Canada by your business. We do, of course, have challenges with the insight into the end of life for plastic products. The regulator just came out with some additional guidance, which our team is still making our way through. But unfortunately, it just hasn't covered some of the issues we were hoping to get more guidance from, including, how far and how expansive is the definition of residency. But we will be putting out a bulletin on kind of what it does tell us and what it doesn't, because there are some situations where you might have kind of an informational gap. One of the things where this comes up a lot is part of the reporting for a producer is being required to report on end of life for the plastic products that you are a producer for. You may have no idea where things end up, or it's going into a building that's going to be there for 200 years. And so the answer of where it's going to end up at end of life is I don't know. Or it's going to be demoed and go in a landfill probably at its end of life, whenever that is, assuming landfills still exist in 200 years and, there's not some magical recovery of all materials to the benefit of the federal government of Canada, I guess. But that's a question we're going to have to answer. So one of the things we've asked is what kind of assumptions can a company make in doing their report to ensure that they are able to comply with the end of life reporting obligations as a producer, where you have very little insight into what happens at the end of life and what kind of assumptions are allowed to be made that are reasonable, that would be acceptable. So we're still waiting on some more guidance on that. We have published a couple of bulletins I think will be of use. So you don't have to remember every single thing that Anik and I said today. One is a general bulletin on the Federal Plastics Registry and the reporting obligations. And we did one specific to the construction industry that we think would be particularly useful. So it's focused really on the construction category, not so much on the EEE category. But it does go into a little more detail on what kind of categories of products are obligated. So that is the takeaways for reporting obligations. And now I will hand it over to Anik to talk about contract implications.
Thanks, Talia. So as Talia mentioned, really at the federal level, they are not interested in your contractual relationships with respect to determining what your reporting obligations are. And so you'll need to look at the products that you are importing and that you are supplying to all of your projects at a business level to determine whether or not you are a producer with reporting obligations for those products. And this is where you are a producer and where you have these obligations, of course, administering and complying will come with costs. And unfortunately, these are not costs that are really accounted for in cost of the work or necessarily in the contract price, subcontract price of your agreements. Really, this is going to be adding to your overhead and administration costs for your business. And so something you'll need to be thinking about as you're bidding and pricing to the extent that you have these obligations. So again, as I've noted on the slide here, The costs for compliance is not something you're going to likely be able to recover as an extra or seek as a change. Most of contracts, including CCDC2, the CCA1, where they do provide for a change to the contract price because there's been a change in laws. It's again really tied to the contract documents, subcontract documents, and not to these types of reporting obligations. So I think the takeaway here really is that taking account for and recovering the costs associated with this, unfortunately, may be challenging. The other thing to think about, and that's not on the slide, is obtaining the information that you need. So when you are contracting with a supplier, for example, where you are the producer because you're the first importer into Canada, when you're contracting with that supplier, providing for and ensuring that you have the ability to get the information you need to comply with your obligations. So you may want to think about including terms in your subcontract or your contract with the supplier to require them to provide you with that information in a timely way so that you have what you need for compliance. So that's another element that you'll want to be thinking about as you enter into the agreements with your suppliers. So as Talia said, again, I think at the project level, this might not really be something that's going to be coming up in your contracts directly, or something that your owners are going to be saying, well, did you do this reporting or anything like that, your clients, your GCs. But at the same time, something you will need to be thinking about so that you make sure you have what you need, and so that to the extent possible, the cost associated with managing these regulatory obligations are recovered in your overall fees. So with that, I think that was really the summary that I had, and I'm looking at the time. I think we are more than happy to answer any questions that you all may have. If you wanted to, I don't know if we've got the chat function or if people wanted to speak, but I think that takes us to the end of the formal part of the presentation.
Well, thanks very much, Anik and Talia. As Anik mentioned, there is a Q&A function and a chat function built in. I think the setup for Teams is that essentially everyone is muted. So apologies for that, for those on the line. But I can relay any questions that do come in through that function. Talia, I know you put a couple resources up on the slide deck during your presentation. For those who are interested in sort of expanding knowledge on this, is there any place in particular you think that we should be sending individuals to learn more about the potential implications of this registry and what it means for them? Oh, you're on mute though, Talia, now.
Thank you. I mean, you can have the pleasure of reading the guidance document, which is 100 pages and pretty detailed, but honestly, there isn't a ton, because what the federal government's done is they kind of have like an overview website, which you can certainly take a look at. And then there's the actual notice itself, which might be useful for looking at definitions to a certain extent, but the bulletins we've written are intended to kind of synthesize the information so it's more digestible and readable. So the only thing would be reading other articles from our competitors. I guess you probably put out similar information, but there isn't some specific document that I think will make it much easier. And one of the challenges I think with this notice, and I've seen in advising various clients on understanding their compliance obligations, is it's really specific to your business, right? It's pretty easy if you're like, I don't make anything remote, like we don't buy anything remotely in that category, or the only thing we buy is from one distributor who has a presence in Canada, like we buy them from a Canadian company, so everything cannot have been imported from us, and we don't have a brand of product that could have plastic on it. So then you're probably just free and clear, and then you're just looking at if you're generating plastic waste. But where you're doing the direct importing, that is the situation where you are the most likely to have to take you are going to have to take a closer look and see where you are the producer and where you're not. Where are you getting these products from? Who is the brand owner for it? Is it easy to see if they have a presence in Canada? And that's where we have to kind of start digging deeper. So it ends up being really specific to your operations, the way you're getting the products, who you're buying the products from, who owns the brand of the products. So there's no way to really do that on a more global level. You really have to look at your own operation. So I consider it more of a staged approach. And that's how I've been approaching it with various clients to help understand, first we have to figure out if you have anything that's actually obligated. We look at the thresholds, and then we look at, okay, are you even a producer? Because you might only be buying products that are obligated under the Federal Plastics Registry, large appliances, let's say, but you are never the producer because of the way your business operates and the way you acquire these products. Or if it's, it's being purchased for you, but it's being purchased by some third party, or your GC's purchasing it and then giving it to you, like that line if impacts whether or not you're the producer. So it's super specific to your agreement, your arrangements, your suppliers, who you're, like the brand of the products you're buying. And that's where you're not going to find that in an article. You have, there's an analysis piece that's required there to really understand. The regulator does respond to questions if you have a specific question directly. But it's not always if your business is pretty straightforward, or you're only really doing one particular area, it's not so complicated usually to figure it out. It just, requires some expertise with the notice.
Yeah. And to Talia's
Quickly-
point, oh, sorry, Ken.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, to Talia's point, when you're considering, all things being equal, what products to supply and what to choose, whether or not importing or supplying the product from a certain brand or a supplier will trigger these obligations is a consideration you may want to take into account. Where all things being equal, if I take product A, I'm not the producer, I won't have these reporting obligations. That may be a reason to choose product A over product B, all other things being equal. So something to think about when you are trying to decide what to supply, or when an owner or a GC specifies, you shall supply this product. Something to bring into the conversation or talk about would be, does that specification imply or carry with it further regulatory obligations here?
I was going to Talia's point, I was going to say, unfortunately, construction has never been accused of being a simple industry. To that point, and perhaps this is for you, Nick, are there potential shifts in ownership of reporting based on the type of project delivery method? Like, would a regular stipulated sum contract place reporting obligations on one party versus what an IPD might do? Like, does a project delivery method or contract type change the potential reporting obligations?
No, in the sense that unless it's changing whether or not you are the one supplying the product, right? So whether you're in an IPD contract or you're in a stipulated price contract, design, bid, build, if you are the one that is purchasing the product and supplying it to the project, then you may be the producer for that product and have these obligations. So the only way that that changes things is if, to Talia's point as well, like if it's another trade or GC on the project, or the owner themselves that are the ones purchasing and supplying the product for you to then install, then that would change it, because you are not the one actually supplying it, the product. But otherwise, if you're the one supplying the product to the project, which delivery method that you're using or contract form that you're using won't change those obligations. And every contract is requiring that you be responsible for compliance with your with all applicable laws and your performance of your work and of your supply of products. So even if it's not expressly stated, the expectation of all the other project parties will be that you are following your reporting obligations as it relates to any products that you're supplying.
I'll say the good news with that, as opposed to when we're talking about excess soil or other environmental regulations, is I don't encourage you to not comply with the Federal Plastics Registry obligations, but it's not going to have a direct impact on the project, right? Where if soil's not being managed properly at the project, there's a potential for investigation or enforcement by the regulator. If there's building code violations, there can be a stop work order, things that actually can like put the project on hold or kind of blow up parts of the project or at least the schedules, timing, and cost. This is an individual company obligation that is purely just to report information to the government. So if you fail to do so, you're in violation, you're going to have compliance issues. There's a risk of enforcement action being taken against you, but it's individually as a company because it has nothing really to do. They don't care what you're using the HVAC. You can keep buying HVAC and importing it from the US and storing it in your basement in an increasing pile. It doesn't matter what it's being used for. And I think that's really a unique thing that is challenging because so much of the construction industry is focused on whose role is what and what my particular task is and what my obligations are. Where here, the fact that you're importing or purchasing these products or supplying these products as part of a construction project is effectively irrelevant for what the Federal Plastics Registry reporting requires. And you kind of have to shift your mindset and think about it that way. It's just, am I buying products? And we know you're not manufacturing them because I know who's on this call. Am I buying products that makes me a producer that requires me to report? Where those products are going and what they're being used for is only useful to the extent you are the producer, and then you have to report on end of life, or you have to talk to the supplier and figure out what kind of plastic resins are in this product or in the plastic components of the product. So that's where your obligations fall, and that's that little scope they fall under, which I think is pretty unique for a lot of other environmental legislation that impacts or regulates or you interact with more in the construction industry.
Yeah. So at that business level, where this becomes relevant to your projects is if you were to fail to comply and be prosecuted under the legislation for failure to comply, that is where, when you go to bid, for example, sometimes in the procurement, you have to disclose charges or other violations of laws that your business may have been subject to, and that can impact your ability to be successful in those bids. And so it's more at the business level, to Talia's point, as opposed to something that the person that you've contracted with, the GC, the owner, are going to have a direct repercussion on the project. But it could still nevertheless affect your business if you fail to comply.
We do have a few questions that have come in, since we've been chatting. The first one, will you be sharing this recording with those in attendance? We will have a recording made available of this, yes. We had a question, what is the reporting structure? How is it done? Are there templates we can use, and where do we submit?
Sure. So there's going to be a portal that's available online to submit. It's not so different from MPRI reporting, National Pollution Release Inventory. I don't know. I would expect most people in this industry aren't, but if you've worked in other industries where you've had facilities that report on pollution emissions, it's a similar concept. So there's a portal where the facility and the company is registered. You put in a bunch of contact information for the company, and then you're going to be supplying information on what category and subcategory the plastics you're a producer for fall into. It's all done by weight and what resins, so what kind of plastic it is, and then also, which is a hard one for somebody at the mechanical contractor level. You're not making that kind of stuff. That's where the supplier conversation comes in. And also what jurisdictions you're supplying it to. So where in Canada is this stuff ending up? So that might not be as challenging for you, because if your business is purely in Ontario, then it's always Ontario. If you work for a national company, you obviously can get a lot more complicated, because you might be ordering big shipments and have some deal to bring in, 100 units a month, and they go to various projects. So that's the relationship you have, and that's the product you work with. And that can be a little more challenging. You also have to report on where these plastics are ending up at their end of life, which is where that assumption piece, where we don't have additional guidance yet, comes into play as well. So the guidance document that comes out, I think, gives a little bit more information on the specifics of the reporting, but it's literally going to be an online form effectively, which I'm sure will have its usual touches of clunkiness because it's a government portal, though I know they don't make it. They contract with somebody to make it. But it'll essentially be like a web portal where the company will have its own login. It'll have an account representative that'll be kind of the person responsible for signing off on all this and confirming it's all accurate. And you'll be plugging all the information I mentioned into that portal on an annual basis, and that's the form of the that the report will take.
We had another question here. As a local branch of a national plastic supplier, will we have to report locally, or will our head office have to report nationally, or is it a situation where it's both?
So that's a great question. If you are the sole branch in Canada, then it's probably going to be you reporting. But you can do it at the national level if you want, right? If you're reporting on behalf of multiple companies or multiple entities, you can do that. You just have to specify that that's what you're doing. You're reporting on behalf of all of them, because they're not so concerned about the individual company that's doing it. They're trying to just get a sense of what's coming into the country, or what's being manufactured within the country. So if you are one local branch, and let's say you have a branch in every province in Canada, or you have multiple in Ontario even, you can consolidate your information and report as a single entity, and just you'll have to note for each of your facilities that you're reporting on behalf of all these multiple facilities across the country.
We had another question here. Does McMillan offer consulting services to Canadian manufacturers and contractors?
For advising on your obligations under the Federal Plastics Registry, absolutely. I am doing that day in, day out lately. So just send me an email and and we can start the relationship, and I can advise you on what you're obligated to do and what not. And it's a kind of iterative process I talked about. We go through it in kind of stages. I get an understanding of your business. Sometimes it's very straightforward. Sometimes if you have a lot of products and your business is super varied, there's a little bit more to go through, but we always get to the finish line. So feel free to reach out. I'll also circulate to Ken so he can share with the attendees our bulletin on the additional guidance that just came out a couple days ago once we complete that. So you can have that as a further resource on that. And also, we're writing on these topics all the time, various developments in environmental law and regulation. So to the extent you're interested in staying up to date, you can just send us an email and we'll add you to the mailing list as well, because that might be useful as we get more if there's additional further guidance that comes, we'll publish on that too, and you can just keep an eye out for it or get an email about it.
I have a final question here. Looks like, will this registry pertain to fiberglass reinforced plastic as well?
Very specific question. I think so, yes. I'd have to see. They're looking at the specific products, so I'd have to take a look, but I would expect so. Okay. I think the default is if you have anything that's made of a plastic that generally is a construction material that is generally part of an electronic, your default is like, I need to go check now in further detail if this is in. If nothing you deal with is a plastic, congratulations. And I'm wishing you all the best. It's so rare. I'm so happy for you. But if not, then we take a little deeper dive. And if it might not be that complicated. Like if you were the manufacturer of a product that falls into one of these categories and it just has a unique name or a unique feature, we can figure out pretty quickly if you're obligated or not. But I like these definitions and subcategories go layers. So I'm hesitant to say something off the cuff. But if it's a plastic product like that, it probably is. But we can take a closer look and maybe you get lucky and maybe you fall within a crack, which has happened.
I'm not seeing any additional questions at this point. I suspect you might be hearing from some of the attendees based on some of the questions that we've seen so far. But on behalf of MCA Canada, again, I want to thank you, Talia and Anik, for taking the time today, providing your expertise on the topic. I know it sounds like we're not done with this. It sounds like it's a topic we're going to continue to have conversations on, particularly as we head into that reporting period. So really do appreciate your insights today, for sharing that information with the membership, and I'm hopeful that we can continue to have this conversation as we move forward, so we can share the most pertinent information with the membership at large. So again, thank you for taking the time. Thank you once again for being members of MCA Canada, and look forward to hopefully doing this again with you soon.
Thanks so much for having us, Ken.
Yeah, thank you, Ken.
Thank you again for everybody in attendance. Have a great day.